Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. Welcome, and it's my very great pleasure. Oh, first of all, my name is Finola Finlay, and I am both Canadian by citizenship and Irish. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce to you Kevin Vickers. Now, as you probably know, Kevin is the Canadian ambassador to Ireland, and he comes from an area of New Brunswick known as the Miramichi. Which is known as the Irish capital of Canada. And we had a kind of a woo moment here a minute ago when he met Tom Kingston, who's Simon's father, and who looks the spitting image of one of his Kingston relatives back in Canada. So he's a Kingston as well. Now, Kevin is going to talk to us today about the Irish soldiers in the Canadian regiments in the First World War, which I think is probably very little known, and we really need to know more about this. So obviously then Kevin is not just an ambassador, he's not just a hero, and you can read all about that somewhere else, but he's also a scholar and an active historian in his own right. So please give a West Cork welcome to Kevin Vickers.
Thank you, everybody. It's very special for me to be here in my ancestral neck of the woods. I'm feeling very privileged and extremely humbled, and a scholar I'm not. I was essentially a guard all my life, and through fate of circumstance, here I am as a Canadian ambassador with Fáilte, Díomh Macoide, Isas Canada Me. At Canada's Confederation in 1867, people of Irish origin were the second largest group in Canada after French Canadians. The threat the Irish Fenians posed south of the border, along with growing concerns over American intentions, had led Canadian fathers of Confederation, including Thomas D'Arcy McGee, originally from Carlingford, to accelerate plans for becoming a Dominion. Ironically, McGee was a leader of the 1848 Rising we heard about this morning against the British in Ireland, one of the 6 risings mentioned in the Proclamation of 1916. At the time of Canadian Confederation, there were approximately 480,000 Irish in Canada, and today close to 5 million Canadians link their ancestry to Ireland. The real threat of invasion that did develop was by an unofficial army calling itself the Fenian Brotherhood, composed of about 1,000 Irish-American war veterans. Their optimistic, if far-fetched goal was to capture and occupy the Canadian colonies so as to force the British to abandon his government of Ireland. They were not very successful. Their efforts placed, however, a stigma upon the Irish people who continued to live and migrate to Canada. Could they really be trusted? Was a bias held towards them by the British colonists of Upper and Lower Canada? Would they too turn side with the Fenians south of the border and rise against the colony in an attempt to free Ireland of British rule? History shows, however, the vast majority of the Irish who emigrated to Canada at the time hoped that Ireland, like Canada and Australia, would achieve its nation status through home rule. In fact, several Irish immigrants who had become members of Parliament in Canada resigned their seats and ran for election in England to champion home rule in the British House of Commons. This is especially true of Irish Catholics in Canada at the turn of the 20th century, who came to believe that Ireland ought to enjoy Canadian-style responsible self-government. At the outbreak of the First World War, the Irish population of Canada was approximately 500,000, and the war provided an opportunity for Irish immigrants to Canada to demonstrate, first of all, that they were loyal to Canada, advance the cause of home rule for Ireland, and promote the idea of freedom for nations, in this case Ireland, by fighting against the Germans. Irish Catholics in Canada were constantly encouraged to join the Canadian Army by the Catholic Church. This encouragement was constant at the outbreak of the war and continued throughout. all the Catholic papers, including the Catholic Register and the Catholic Record of the time, promoted Irish recruitment. I would recommend all of you who are interested in the subject, there's a book that was just released by a professor from the University of Toronto, Mark McGowan, and he's just released a book, published a book called The Imperial Irish. And it's quite fascinating, but just on the back here it says, between 1914 and 1918, many Irish Catholics in Canada found themselves in a vulnerable position. Not only was the Great War slaughtering millions, but tension and violence was mounting in Ireland over the question of independence from Britain and home rule. For Canada's Irish Catholics, thwarting Prussian militarism was a way to prove that small nations, like Ireland, could be free from larger occupying countries. Yet, even as tens of thousands of Irish Catholic men and women rallied to the call to arms and supported government efforts to win the war, many Canadians still doubted their loyalty to the Empire. Retracing the struggles of the Irish Catholics as they fought Canada's enemies in Europe while defending themselves against the charges of disloyalty at home, this book, The Imperial Irish, explores the development and fraying of the interfaith and intercultural relationships between Irish Catholics, French Canadian Catholics, and non-Catholics throughout the Great War. Mark McGowan contrasts Irish Canadian Catholics' beliefs with neutrality of Pope Benedict XV and Irish Republicans inciting rebellion in Ireland, and argues that for the most part, Irish Catholics in Canada demonstrated strong support for the Imperial War effort by recruiting in large numbers. So there's a very interesting book that's very topical in regards to what we were discussing earlier this morning. Now, on a personal level, as a small child, I recall crawling up on the lap of my grandfather, Samuel Kingston. He was a second-generation Irish Canadian whose grandfather, Paul Kingston, left Bantry Bay in 1826 for Miramichi, New Brunswick. He was wounded during the First World War, returning with ammunition to his group, who were all killed by a single barrage from German gunfire, and he himself being hit with shrapnel. He lost many friends during the war. Now, just for context, Miramichi was a destination point for the Irish, and in particular, those from West Cork. Boats left regularly from Cork in the early 1800s, long before the famine, loaded with Irish passengers, and would return loaded with lumber that was desperately needed in Ireland. During these early years, their destination points were Pictou, Nova Scotia, St. John, New Brunswick, St. Andrews, and my home, Miramichi, New Brunswick. In these early years, these Irish migrants were leaving for employment and the possibility of owning land. Now, I don't want to bore you, but I'm going to do this just to show you the concentration and connection between my home and West Cork. The people of my hometown, Miramichi, are all Irish, and most of them are from West Cork. The Miramichi, as we just heard, considers itself the Irish capital of Canada. And the names of the people at home are Kingston, McCarthy, Doyle, Duffy, Walsh, Driscoll, Donovan, Brennan, Brophy, Buckley, Clark, Coughlin, Connell, Kavanagh, Cassidy, Donoghue, Ahern, Flanagan, O'Shea, O'Brien, Shanahan, Flynn, Ryan, Butler, Fitzpatrick, Kenny, Lyons, Lynch, Power, and Quinn. And not only do these people have your names, they look like you do. We look like you do. They act like you do, and though my staff get mad at me when I say this, they drink like you. It was the sons of these families who signed up for the First World War and joined the North Shore Regiment in New Brunswick. And during the First World War, the regiment augmented the 12th Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force in 1914. The unit also supported the 132nd North Shore Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force and the 165th Acadian Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force. All three of these battalions went overseas to England and served in various capacities in France and Flanders. The 132nd was broken up in England, and a large number of the men were sent as reinforcements to the 87th Grenadier Guards and the 42nd Royal Highlanders of Canada. These men went to France in March 1917 and soon were absorbed in different companies of the units they joined. They became accustomed to trench warfare in short order and then went out for training for the great attack of April 9th, the capture of Vimy Ridge. Many of the 132nd men fell in the fighting on that Easter Monday, as they were in large numbers from Nova Scotia and Ontario. Now, almost 20,000 Irish soldiers served in the Canadian Army during the First World War. A total of 19,327 of those served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force who were Irish. This number comes from the Department of National Defence in Canada, but may well be an underestimation. Indeed, I was talking to Lara earlier this morning, and his numbers are much higher than mine. Canada's involvement in the First World War was immense, with 630,000 enlisting out of a population of just 8 million. Some 60,661 were killed. No breakdown by nationality has been done for Canada's casualty figures. However, on a pro rata basis, the figures suggest about 2,000 Irish-born Canadians probably died during the First World War fighting for Canada. Now, among those who died was a Jimmy Duffy from County Sligo. He was regarded as one of the best marathon runners in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. He won the Boston Marathon in 1914, and living in Canada at the time, he enlisted in the Canadian Army and was killed at the Second Battle of Ypres in May 1915, 8 days before his birthday. He is one of 11 men from Sligo who died in the Canadian Army and are included in a new local historical history project which seeks to find a more definitive number of the war dead from that county. Unlike other British dominions, as they were at the time, Canada went out of its way to specifically recruit Irish soldiers, and a number of Irish battalions were raised during the war. The Canadian Expeditionary Force and an Irish regiment, the Royal Irish Lancers, were involved in the last Allied action of the war, the Liberation of Mons and Armistice Day, 1918. The literature is full of examples of bravery of Irish-born Canadian soldiers. Let me give you an example. Frederick Hall was a Canadian recipient of Victoria Cross, the highest and most prestigious award for gallantry in the face of the enemy that can be awarded to British and Commonwealth forces. He was born in Kilkenny in 21 February 1885. And Hall emigrated to Canada approximately 1910 and lived in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He was 30 years old and an company sergeant major in the 8th Winnipeg Rifles Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force, during the First World War, when he performed a deed for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. It was on the night of April 24th, 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium, that Hall discovered a number of men who were missing. On the ridge above, he could hear moans from the wounded men. Under cover of darkness, he went to the top of the ridge on 2 separate occasions and returned each time with a wounded man. By 9 o'clock in the morning on the 24th, there were still men missing. In full daylight and under sustained and intense enemy fire, Hall crawled out toward the wounded, when a wounded man who was lying some 15 yards from the trench called for help. Company Sergeant Hall endeavored to reach him in the face of heavy enemy gunfire. He then made a second most gallant attempt and was in the act of lifting up the wounded man to bring him in when he fell, mortally wounded in the head. The soldier he attempted to help was also shot and killed. Decorations of the Medal of Frederick William Hall are on display in Manitoba Museum, Winnipeg, Manitoba. And interestingly, Frederick Hall lived on a street in Winnipeg called Pine Street. In 1925, Pine Street was renamed Valor Road because, in actual fact, at the end of the war, there were 3 Victoria Cross recipients who lived on that one street. This is but one story that shows the gallantry of the Irish-born Canadian soldier of the First War. Another example would be Brigadier Frederick Morris Watson Harvey. He was an Irish-Canadian soldier and a previous rugby union player. During the First World War, while serving in the Canadian Army, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the Military Cross, and the French Croix de Guerre. Prior to the war, Harvey made 2 senior appearances for Ireland in rugby. He played in the 1907 Home Nations Championship against Wales at Cardiff Arms Park. And then he played for Ireland for a second and last time in 1911, the Five Nations Championship at Mardyke, winning 25-5 against France. Harvey first arrived in Canada in 1908, where he worked as a surveyor in northern Alberta and High River. On the 18th of May 1916, he enlisted in the 13th Regiment Canadian Mounted Rifles at Medicine Hat, Alberta. He was subsequently commissioned as a lieutenant and posted to the Western Front in 1916. He then transferred to Lord Strathcorner's Horse, Royal Canadians, part of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade. Harvey was awarded the Victoria Cross following an incident on the 27th of March 1917 at the village of Guyancourt. During an attack by his regiment on a village, a party of the enemy ran forward to a wired trench just in front of the village and opened rapid fire and machine gun fire at very close range, causing heavy casualties in the leading troop. At this critical moment, when the enemy showed no intention whatsoever retiring, and fire was still intense, Lieutenant Harvey, who was at command of the leading troops, ran forward well ahead of his men and dashed at the trench, skillfully manned, jumped the wire, shot the machine gunner, and captured the gun. His most courageous act undoubtedly had a decisive effect on the success of the operations. Harvey was originally awarded the Distinguished Service Order, was later upgraded to Victoria Cross. In March 1918, Harvey was awarded the Military Cross for the same action that earned another soldier the Victoria Cross. After the war, Harvey remained with Lord Strathcorner's Horse and was promoted to captain in 1923. He then served as instructor at the Royal Military College of Canada. In 1938, he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and became the commanding officer of Lord Strathcorner's Horse. In 1939, he was made a brigadier and commander of the 13th Alberta Military District. He died at age 91 and was buried at cemetery in Fort Macleod, Alberta. There was no greater tragedy or sacrifice during the First World War than the losses sustained by the Newfoundland Regiment at Beaumont-Hamel on July 1st, 1916, which were staggering. Of the some 800 Newfoundlanders who went into battle that morning, only 68 were able to answer the roll call the next day, and more than 700 killed, wounded, or missing. A generation of the small colony had been killed. The Newfoundlander sacrifice did not go unnoticed on the front lines. And as I mentioned earlier this morning, there was a commander of the 29th British Division, and instead of the actions of the regiment, it was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and its assault only failed of success because dead men cannot advance any further. The Newfoundland Regiment would be practically wiped out, but the survivors would continue to see action and fighting, and reinforcements would come to help and rebuild the regiment. The regiment would go on to earn the official designation Royal from the British Crown in recognition of its gallant actions in battle at Ypres and Cambrai later in the war, the only unit of the British Army to earn that distinction during the war years. I should say the Army. By the end of the war, more than 6,200 Newfoundlanders had served in its ranks, with more than 1,300 of them losing their lives and another 2,500 being wounded or taken prisoner. The loss of so many lives, compounded by the number of wounded, disabled, and sick who returned to Newfoundland after war, would have significant impact on the colony for many years after. But again, what always interests me is the names, and the names of those men that had been so quickly sacrificed. The names of the regiment, and they include McCarthy, Doyle, Hickey, Lynch, Power, McGrath, Morris, Murphy, Murray, Fitzgerald, Breen, Butler, Callahan, Carl, Clark, Cleary, Coughlan, and on it goes. Now, there were a number of Irish regiments established at the outbreak of the war. One that remains is the Irish Regiment of Canada. It's the only kilted Irish regiment outside of Ireland. The 2nd Battalion, the Irish Regiment of Canada, is Canada's only remaining Irish unit. The battalion remains established as a company with battalion headquarters reflecting a recruiting strength of roughly 120 soldiers. Headquarters located in Sudbury Armory in Sudbury, Ontario. The unit tartan is a saffron pattern, and the motto is, and forgive my Irish, Fear Go Wa, Gaelic for faithful until death. The unit's history traces back to the founding of the Irish Regiment of Canada on October 15th, 1915, and is part of the World War's mobilization. The Irish Regiment of Canada originated in Toronto when an infantry regiment was authorized to be formed. It was designated the 110th Irish Regiment on the 1st of January 1916 and was redesignated the Irish Regiment on 1st of May 1920 and the Irish Regiment of Canada on the 1st of September 1932. The regiment's soldiers were reorganized into several different units within the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Though the unit did not enter battle as a formed entity, the valor and sacrifice of individual soldiers was unprecedented. 60% of the original draft were killed or wounded, allows the Irish Regiment to retain 10 battle honours from the First World War. The Irish Regiment of Canada continued on and played a significant role as well during the Second World War. Now, names of other Irish Canadian units. We had the Irish Canadian Rangers from 1914, which was disbanded in 1936. The Irish Fusiliers of Canada, formed in 1913 in Vancouver. The 121st Western Irish Battalion, formed in 1915 in New Westminster, British Columbia. The 199th Duchess of Connaught's own Irish Battalion, formed in 1916, and it was absorbed into a reserve battalion upon arrival in England. There was the 208th Canadian Irish Battalion, formed in 1916 in Toronto, used as reinforcements to other units in England and disbanded in 1920. It is evident that the participation of Irish-born Canadian soldiers was significant and profound during the First World War. Conscription had been brought in during the war, compelling men to enlist, and though I've not found exact numbers, it was apparent that there were numbers of Irish Canadians who refused to enlist because of British rule in Ireland. I always find Irish history fascinating. I mentioned at the outset of my speech of a gentleman by the name of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, and I heard comments this morning of the last coordinator of the last panel talking about the 1814 rising. There's a gentleman from Carlingford, Ireland, who led that rising. He hid in County Donegal dressed as a Catholic priest for 2 years, escaped to the United States, did not like the way the Irish were being treated in America, and he came to Canada. He came up to Upper and Lower Canada at the time, to Montreal. In Montreal, he became what is known as one of our most prolific fathers of Confederation, promoting Canada to become a self-government dominion, and led all those meetings leading up to our Confederation and Dominion of the country. Now, when he was 1848, he made the comment, "If ever I give up on the cause of Ireland, it'll be a dog's death that I deserve." But anyways, Canada did become a dominion. And of course, the Queen remains as a head of state. So the Fenians took exception to this. And a year after we became a country and he became a member of Parliament, a knock came to his door one night and 2 Fenian men from Boston shot him dead. Our first and only political assassination in Canada. 100,000 people showed up at his funeral in Montreal. 100,000 in 1868, 100,000. More importantly, Catholics and Protestants, because he really championed during his speeches and being a catalyst for Canada to petition to become a dominion, a peaceful road for Catholics and Protestants. But in any event, a message came from the boys down south. It was a dog's death that he deserved and a dog's death that he got. And that was it. But what fascinates me about Irish history, I go around Ireland and I said, now here's a lad that led your 1848 rising. And I can't find a single educator who knows the story about our father of Confederation, Thomas D'Arcy McGee, and the role. So I have a local pub I go to. I'm not, as you could already tell, a real diplomat. And I love my pints. So I have a friend at the pub, and I told Roger, you know, the more I'm here, the more I find Irish history confusing. For example, here we have 20,000 Irish-born soldiers fighting for Canada during the First World War, and in fact Britain during the First War. At the same time, we have a rising in 1916. And you know, I've learned like I mentioned this morning, 5,000 men, Irish boys, were killed just from the city of Cork alone, 5,000. But yet, you know, we have at the same time this rising goes on. And I said, you know, I get awfully confused in hearing all these different things, you know. He said, Ambassador, I have some good advice for you. Stay confused. Thank you very much. That's my presentation.
I'll throw it open for questions. Yes.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. It's fascinating. Were there similar Scottish regiments, battalions?
Yeah, there was the total number that I have, and Lar maybe he seems to have more up-to-date facts and figures than I do, but the number that I had total Irish born Canadians and Scots was 37,000, of which just under 20,000 were Irish. So it'd be approximately 17,000 Scots that would have participated in the war.
Sorry, no, that's my name. I have here the name of three Skibbereen who fought the Canadian regiments and were killed in the First World War. We have George Ernest Hosford, who was born in Castlelavan out here, and he obviously had emigrated to Canada. He was in the Western Ontario Regiment, killed on the Western Front. Vivian Wilson from Balladahob, 3rd Battalion, Central Ontario Regiment, also killed on the Western Front, age 21. And there's one other, there's so many pages in the book, I think back and forth. But that's two. And I knew a veteran who had fought with the Canadians in the First World War. Now, he was an old man by the time I knew him. And he had been gassed.
Yes.
So he was kind of semi-invalid. His story was he was a native up here, had gone to England to work on the railways, decided to go to Canada. The railways were opening up. A bunch of them went to work on the railways. And while they were there, they got drafted.
Yes.
He didn't do much fighting, I think. He never told his family very much. His daughter to this day knows precious little about what he actually did or didn't see in the war, just that he was gassed. He spent years in sanatoria afterwards, but he did recover sufficiently to live to a ripe old age.
Yes. As
the only one I'm aware of.
Yeah, and I know, and you know as I mentioned there during my talk, there was approximately, we believe, 2,000 Irish-born Canadians that would have had paid the ultimate sacrifice during the war.
Sorry, what?
Oh,
somebody's.
oh God. Yeah.
We'll just pause here while this gentleman is being attended to. Is there a doctor in the house?
I think so. Yes. We haven't got doctor yet.
There he is. You should just sit for a while. Oh, I met him earlier. He's quite intoxicated.
I think this gentleman's being attended to now. So there was another question from the back. Yes, the man in the grey, in the grey shirt.
Well, about it's not really a fair question about French Canadians compared to the First World War and the attitudes towards enlistment and conscription there. I only know tangentially from reading Mackenzie King's diaries that even in the Second World War.
Yeah. You know, I was so impressed by all the panelists, but you yourself, the knowledge and thing. I have a prize for you. You win the prize of getting this book because the whole French story and their reluctance to participate in the First World War and the challenges back and forth of that played with Irish-born Canadians joining, really interesting. So come up and I'll present you with this book for your great work this morning. Because it's a very detailed history of the recruitment. And the other thing that I think it might serve you well as well, you made the comment that, you know, after they leave Ireland, you know, can you consider them really having an influence on Ireland? You mentioned the names of New Zealanders who lost their lives at Gallipoli. But I think you'll find in this book there's quite a concentrated thought about Ireland and home rule in the recruitment process of the First World War. So I'm sure you'll enjoy that.
Thank you very much.
All right, and I think there was, yes, another question.
You mentioned something about the recruitment policy that went on to try to get, in particular, Irish to join the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Did that go outside into the U.S.? The reason why I'm asking is my granduncle was living in Boston and ended up enlisting in Canada.
Yeah.
I was just curious to see if it had gone
Yeah,
outside.
yeah. Well, you know, the earlier on in the war, the U.S. Did not participate. So I think it was a way for and there was a lot of migration from in Canada specifically to join the war, and in particular as well at that time, there's a lot of Irish boys left Ireland to come to Canada as an example. One of the gentlemen I've mentioned here during my course, specifically so that they could fight in the war. So the reason for going to Canada was to join. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Kevin. That's great talk. Thank you. An aside and then a question. You mentioned about the proud record of the Royal Regiment of Ireland. The Irish Regiment of Canada.
Yes.
And they served in the Second World War, as you said.
Yes.
My father served in the Irish Brigade, 38th Irish Brigade, in the Second World War. And after the breakthrough of Gustav Line near Monte Cassino, there was a road junction and the traffic was all over the place. And the policeman on the road, the military policeman, was directing traffic. And the upshot was he said, Canadian Irish this way, English Irish that way. But the question is, it's in the folklore of the Irish, whether it's true or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
The question actually, the reassimilation in 1918-19 when they came home, was there any issues to do with their feeling separate from the normal trauma of people being demobilized?
No, and you know, I think perhaps what they set out to do is to show that they were loyal to Canada, that they were loyal to Canada, and that wanting to promote home rule and wanting to free nations of large occupation, in this case Ireland. I think they served them well. And now we have a litany of these Irish men going on to having exceptional political careers in Canada. You know, we have several prime ministers we've had several prime ministers of Irish background, as well as what we call premiers in Canada, which would be equivalent to U.S. governors. Again, it's an incredible link in culture and history between the two countries. Yeah, yeah.
Anybody else?
Good.
Shall we? Oh, yes, sorry, William.
Also, just to finish off Maura's talk earlier, the third individual was Timothy Joseph McCarthy from Laos, and he immigrated to St. John, New Brunswick.
St. John, New Brunswick, yeah.
And I think the 60th Canadian infantry.
Yeah.
In October 1960. And again, just to comment as well that you mentioned the links between West Cork and New Brunswick as well. And it's
Yeah.
something that maybe this festival can take up sometime because it is something that very much is forgotten. This side of the
Well, yeah.
West Cork.
We're all very proud. I'm very proud when I go back home to say I'm from Bantry. But I think that to your point is when Irving Oil from St. John, New Brunswick recently bought out Whitegate in Cork, Ireland's own Irish. St. John, New Brunswick was something like, prior to the famine, 80,000 Irish from West Cork went to St. John, New Brunswick. 80,000. Prior to the famine. It was like another 100 and some odd thousand during the famine, but 80,000 before the famine. But anyways, the Irvings came over with their supervisors, their senior management team, for the opening of Irving Oil Westgate. Walsh, Doyle, Butler, all the names were there, and as I just said in my speech, all looking like the audience, but the audience have no clue in Cork of the relationship and the history that you speak of.
As a member of the organizing committee, I'm getting this great idea for a field trip to New Brunswick. Or an exchange, right?
Yeah.
Ambassador Vickers, thank you so much. I think that was eye-opening for many of us. As I said at the beginning, as a Canadian Irish person myself, I acquired this funny accent through 40 years in Canada, but I did go to UCC, and I've really been, as I've studied the links between the two countries, I've really been impressed. Just a bit of shameless self-promotion. If you go on my last blog post at roaringwaterjournal.com, you'll see a whole post about the links between Canada and Ireland, including a picture of the memorial slab in Bandon Church to Justin Trudeau's great-great-great-great grandfather. So thank you, Ambassador Vickers, very much indeed.
Good.